Well, you saw and you have heard certainly about organizations like the Michigan Law Innocence Clinic, but certainly they tend to get publicity when cases like the Lorinda Swain case come to fruition like they did last week. And you begin to learn some of the nuances of what's going on behind the scenes to try and eventuate an outcome like the Swain case. And so it was sort of interesting to contemplate a discussion with the folks from there. And so we're making that happen this morning. David Moran is the co-director of the Michigan Law Innocence Clinic in Ann Arbor, and he joins us this morning. David, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. I'm actually the sole director now.
Oh, okay.
A few years ago, my co-founder, Bridget McCormick, was elected to the Michigan Supreme Court. So
yes.
I'm just the director.
Well, and let's talk about how this came about. There must have been some sort of observation that there were wrongful convictions out there and something had to be done.
There was. I had been a appellate defender at the State Appellate Defender Office in Detroit for 8 years, and I had 5 cases where we were able to exonerate people, and these were just random cases from around Michigan of the 200 or so cases that I was assigned. And Bridget McCormick had a number of exoneration cases she'd worked on. She'd been also a public defender in New York and then come to Michigan. And so we knew that there were a lot of wrongful convictions, and DNA doesn't get all of them. In fact, DNA only gets a small fraction of them because in the vast majority of cases, there is no DNA to test.
Right.
And so there was a DNA innocence project already started at Cooley Law School, which is still going now it's at Western Michigan.
Right.
But there was no resource for people who had been wrongfully convicted in Michigan in cases in which there was no biological evidence to test. And so that's what we set out to start.
Yeah, and I guess that's a whole nuance of the subject that we can talk about. But staying broad here on the subject for a second, we're just talking about the two of you that recognize this. So is it fair to say then there are a whole host of wrong convictions out there that we should be worried about?
Unfortunately, yes. What the DNA cases have shown us is that the wrongful conviction rate was a lot higher than for generations we were led to believe in the United States. We were led to believe that our criminal justice system, with all of its protections, was almost foolproof. Mm-hmm. But DNA exoneration after DNA exoneration and then non-DNA exoneration after non-DNA exoneration has shown that's not true. And so there's been some attempts to study how frequently wrongful convictions in felony cases happen. And all these studies have limitations because they use limited databases. They have to. But every study, including cases involving the death penalty, have come up with a number somewhere between 3 and 5% of all convictions. So if you extrapolate that, then in Michigan that would suggest that we have probably 1,200 or so people in prison right now who are wrongfully convicted. Nationally, we probably have 50 or 60,000 people who are wrongfully convicted. And we'll never identify the vast majority of them because the vast majority of them we won't be lucky enough to find the new evidence that proves their innocence. But we can try and find as many as we can. And one of the points of this movement is that by exonerating people and showing what went wrong in their cases, we're also pushing for reform to make the criminal justice system more accurate. In these cases where we get the wrong people, it usually means that the real perpetrator remains free. And our experience in the Michigan Innocence Clinic's experience nationwide in these cases is that the real perpetrator, having gotten away with it, feels even more empowered and emboldened to keep committing crimes.
Keep doing it. That's right.
And so and what happens when you have a wrongful conviction is the police investigation, they get their suspect, it shuts down completely. And they stop investigating. And so they never stumble upon the real perpetrator, and the real perpetrator then commits a lot more crimes. So we've seen that in our cases where we've been able to exonerate people. Many of our cases, the evidence we found points to the real perpetrator, and then when we looked, we discovered the real perpetrator committed a lot more crimes.
I'll bet that's true. We're talking with David Moran of the Michigan Law Innocence Clinic in concert with the work being done at the U of M Law School, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And, of course, the broad question as well, how does this happen? How do the wrong people end up in jail? We'll talk about that coming up shortly. We're here with David Moran this half hour, who's director of the Michigan Law Innocence Clinic, among other cases, also having worked for the outcome you heard about late last week in the Lorinda Swain case. So how does this happen, David? I mean, in so much as you can draw conclusions that are common across wrongful conviction cases, how do we send the wrong people to jail?
Well, I'd recommend your readers get a book on Amazon or wherever they get their books called Actual Innocence, which it looks at the first 150 DNA exonerations and charts exactly what went wrong in these cases. It's a really good read. And what we see are the same things over and over again. We see bad eyewitness identification procedures that lead the witness to pick out the wrong person.
Oh.
We see false confessions in about 25% of the exonerations, the almost 2,000 exonerations now that have been documented since 1990. The defendant has falsely confessed, usually under pressure. We see the use of jailhouse snitches and informants who are getting a deal in order to testify against somebody else, and then they lie.
Huh.
We see in almost half of the cases, we see bad forensics. Somebody comes in a white lab coat and says, I ran a test and something from the crime scene matches the defendant, and I'm certain. And it turns out that that's junk science or maybe good science but done badly. Almost 50% of the cases involve that.
Oh,
Prosecutorial and police misconduct in roughly half of the cases. Typically what that is that the police or the prosecution have a piece of evidence that proves the defendant didn't do it, and they don't turn it over. And in what I think in Michigan is the leading cause is bad defense lawyering. In Michigan, we have a system of providing lawyers for poor people at trial level that is one of the very worst in the nation. A study was done, commissioned by the legislature a few years back, that confirmed that we have one of the 5 worst systems in the country. And to his credit, Governor Snyder has created an indigent defense commission that is at work now, making recommendations as to how to prove our system, but we still have a long way to go. So in the Michigan Innocence Clinic, we take cases just from Michigan. We see all of these causes, but we especially see a lot of cases where the defense lawyer had no resources and therefore could not hire an investigator, could not talk with experts, and really didn't do any investigation. Oftentimes they didn't take simple steps like talking to the alibi witnesses who would have proved the defendant wasn't there.
so is this simply, generally we should say, in cases of a defendant electing to employ the services of a PD, public defender, or is that just by virtue of having chosen the wrong lawyer?
Both, but in Michigan, the problem is that the vast majority of counties, we don't even have a public defender. In only 8, I believe, is the current number of our 83 counties in Michigan, do we even have a public defender. In the other counties, then the judge appoints a lawyer off a list, but these lawyers have other cases that are paid cases that are going to be higher priority given how little money they're getting paid to do the indigent work.
Wow.
And oftentimes people will take way too many of these cases to do a decent job on any of them, because the only way to make ends meet if you're going to take some of these cases is to take hundreds of them. And so it's a real problem that we just don't. You get what you pay for. And Michigan is, as I said, in the bottom 5, or was as of a few years ago, in the bottom 5 for how much we pay for indigent defense.
We're talking with David Moran, director of the Michigan Law Innocence Clinic. When we come back in a minute, we'll find out what's being done to correct this problem in Michigan. With David Moran this half hour, director of the Michigan Law Innocence Clinic. And David, you know, the Swain case was a pretty well publicized case, so I imagine it was easy to find, or easy to be alerted about that case, I presume.
Actually, it was brought to us by Bill Proctor, the former Channel 7 news anchor from Detroit.
Yeah.
And he's the one who first told us about the case. And so when Bridget McCormick and I opened the clinic in 2009, this was one of the very first cases we took.
Very first. Wow. So what was challenging or different about this case than maybe some of the others you've seen?
Well, it's different in a lot of the cases. Swain, by the way, is the 12th victory we've had in the Innocence Clinic. We've won cases, 9 women, 3 men.
Uh-huh.
9 men, 3 women who've collectively served over 130 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. What's different about this case is that it's not a whodunit. It's was it done?
Yes.
Because we had the allegations of Lorinda's son that she was sexually abusing him But he was telling us from day one that this didn't ever happen and that he was pressured into making these false allegations. And by this point, he was an adult.
Yeah.
So nobody was pressuring him when we were talking to him. He was an adult living on his own, and he was, and his little brother, Cody, were telling us that it wasn't happening. And that's a hard case to win. And, in fact, we didn't win it based on Ronnie's recantation. You can't – it's almost impossible to win a case when somebody recants just on that recantation. The law hates recantation.
Uh-huh.
So we had to go out and find witnesses who would confirm that Ronnie's recantation was true, and we did. We found a bus driver, a school bus driver, a neighbor, a kid. We found one of Lorinda's former boyfriends who really didn't like Lorinda at all, but who was willing to tell the truth. And it turns out he had actually told the truth to the police back in the day when these charges were being levied. And all of these people said the story that Ronnie was telling of this daily sexual abuse was impossible. It could not have been happening because they would have seen it, or they would have seen parts of it. And so we presented all this evidence to Judge Sent, who was the former prosecutor in the county for 20 years.
Right.
And he heard all these witnesses who had no reason to lie whatsoever for Lorinda, and he knew they were telling the truth. And so he did the right thing, granted the new trial twice. And unfortunately, the prosecution appealed all the way both times, and that's why it took 7 years after we started to find this new evidence to ultimately clear her.
Yeah.
So that's a good example, though. The challenge is there's no DNA. What we had to do was, and our students do, and this is what makes this a great program for our students, is they go out and they reinvestigate these cases, and they're knocking on doors and sitting in people's living rooms and talking to them about what they saw and gathering affidavits and finding documents and taking photos of crime scenes. And our students did terrific work over the years. We had 18 students over the 7 years who worked on this case who did terrific work finding these witnesses and talking to them and helping us figure out our strategy to go to court.
Well, you presume that's an education and an impressive one. If you're a law student and you're gathering your your bearings for a future career in law, learning about how a wrongful case gets this far has to smack you on the side of the head.
Absolutely. And even if you're not going to do criminal law, learning how to investigate a case, learning how to go and knock on some stranger's door and get asked in and sit in their living room and ask them questions and get answers, that is a skill that is transferable to most areas of the law. Mm-hmm. So our students get a terrific education about how to investigate.
Is there added pressure when a case involves the molestation of a child to push that case forward? And I ask that because that's the sort of the feel I get in watching documentaries and hearing things about cases like this. When there's an assertion like this, there's almost this vast pressure to get a conviction.
Unfortunately true.
Yeah.
Unfortunately true. I mean, child molestation is a horrific crime. It happens far too often. Nobody's going to deny that it happens. The problem is that if you happen to be one of the people who are wrongfully convicted or wrongfully accused of child molesting, the presumption of innocence tends to fly out the window.
Yeah.
When you're charged with such a terrible crime, it's very hard for people to believe that maybe it didn't happen. So it does happen, but if you happen to be one of the few people who gets swept up into a false claim of child molesting, good luck in getting a jury or a judge to believe that it's not true.
That's incredible. Yeah, because you presume there's also pressure among law enforcement and the prosecutor and so on that if this person is not convicted, there's going to be problems.
Right. And we have a case out of Detroit I'll just mention briefly.
Yeah.
Where our client has been in prison since 1986. His name is Carl Vinson.
86?
86. And somebody broke in to a house in Detroit and viciously raped a 9-year-old girl in her bed. I mean, horrific crime. And the girl, with the prompting of her mother, eventually identified Carl Vinson as the guy who broke in and raped her. And what we've discovered since then is it couldn't have been Carl Vinson because he has the wrong blood type. This is pre-DNA, but they were able to obtain the blood type from the biological evidence that was left at the scene. And the rapist had blood type O, and Carl Vinson has blood type AB. But despite that, Carl remains in prison all these years because there is such resistance to admitting that he's not a child molester. He's not a child rapist.
That's incredible. So what is being done now in the short time we have left to try and correct this problem? This, what did you say, 3% or so of cases that are wrong?
Well, there have been a lot of legislative efforts nationally and some in Michigan as well, and also other efforts. So in Michigan, we got a task force together, the state bar did, that has recommended strong improvements to the way we do eyewitness identifications in Michigan. The state bar also put together a task force that recommended, and the legislature adopted a requirement that the police record interrogations in serious crimes, and Governor Snyder signed it. So that helps eliminate the pressure that we see, or at least it brings to light the pressure that we see when the police are pressuring somebody to falsely confess to something they didn't do. The National Academy of Sciences in 2009 issued a set of recommendations as to how to improve forensic sciences in the United States. I'm actually a member of a National Institute of Standards and Technology Commission that is working on that project now as well. And so we're hoping to see strong recommendations for better improvements, for improvements in forensic science soon. I mentioned the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission that's going on in Michigan. One area that hasn't really been addressed is how to deal with prosecutorial and police misconduct more effectively to try and deter that from happening. And one state so far, Illinois, has passed a law that limits the use of jailhouse informant testimony, and I'm hoping other states will follow that one as well.
There seems to be a lot of potential motivation that isn't necessarily good in that area.
Yeah, the sum of it all is that the point of the work that we do is not just to exonerate the innocent, but to make the criminal justice system more accurate. And nobody's in favor of incarcerating the wrong people, and nobody's in favor of the criminal justice system having blinders on and missing the real perpetrator. And so these simple reforms, none of which are likely to lead to more guilty people getting off, will help us make our criminal justice system more accurate, and that's a good thing for all of us.
And we'll leave it there. We appreciate your time, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
David Moran is the director of the Michigan Law Innocence Clinic in Ann Arbor, integral in the outcome of the Swain case you've heard so much about.